Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you. Welcome to Explore, a faculty led webinar series designed to help high school students discover, engage with different academic disciplines. Through these webinars, Ashoka faculty will give you a glimpse of how subjects are taught and studied at Ashoka. Thank you for joining us today. Today's session is on unlocking the mysteries of sleep. I'm I am Charan. I head the outreach for the South region and I'm based out of Hyderabad. Joining me today is one of Ashoka's most distinguished professors, Professor Krishna Melnattur, is the Associate Professor of Biology and Psychology at Ashoka. Professor Krishna is interested in understanding how brains generate adaptive behaviors. To get at these questions, his lab uses a variety of techniques, including genetics, circuit tracing tools, physiology, and behavioral measurements. His current interests are studying sleep in the fly, Drosophila. His work speaks to two aspects of sleep. Um, that sleep is plastic, that is modifiable by environmental changes, and in turn supports brain plasticity and learning. In so doing, his work addresses fundamental questions around both the law, how, and why of sleep. Prior to joining Ashoka, Krishna was a staff scientist in the Department of Neuroscience, Washington University School of Medicine, studying sleep in the fly Drosophila with Dr. Paul Shaw. He received a PhD from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, studying neural development with Dr. John Nambu. A very warm welcome to you, Professor. We also have with us an Ashoka student, Ria Jain. Ria is a third year undergraduate student at Ashoka University, majoring in biology with minors in chemistry and mathematics. She is broadly interested in the fields of public health, implementation science, and infectious disease dynamics. Currently, Ria is working as a research intern at the Mistranslation and Resistance to Antibiotics MIRA lab at Ashoka University, where she's exploring the role of wastewater derived DNA in transmission of antibiotic resistance to bacteria. She's also serving as the student representative of the biology program this year. After Ashoka, Ria hopes to work towards addressing complex challenges at the intersection of health, society, and policy. Welcome, Ria. Before we get started, I would like to inform our audience that registrations for the UG program starting next year, that is August 2026, are now open. I would encourage students to register soon and have access to personalized mentorship with our academic counselors, interaction with the Ashoka students to learn more about the campus life and receive guidance for Ashoka's holistic admission process. Now, without any further ado, let's get started. I would request our audience to kindly type in any questions they might have in the Q&A box provided on your Zoom screen. We will be taking up at the end of the session. Over to you. Priya, please go
Here.
ahead.
Yeah. So thank you so much for that introduction. I'm glad to be here and just I remember attending these webinars myself, so it's kind of refreshing to be on the delivering end of this. Yeah, I'll just maybe let Professor Krishna start off with a basic introduction of his work and then we can build off of that. Also, as a disclaimer, I am as new to this field as I'm sure many of you would be. I'm not, as you heard, I'm not a neuroscience person. My, interests lie elsewhere. So I am also hoping to gain.
Just blanked out for a minute, but thank you, Ria. Thank you so much. Ria is one of our bright students, so don't let her fool you. Thank you, thank you to Ashoka for giving me this opportunity. It's really happy to talk to you all. So as you've heard, my name is Krishna Minathur. I'm a faculty member here at Ashoka for the last 4 years or so. And so my lab studies sleep and plasticity and memory. We largely use the fly Drosophila as a model. And I'm sure we can get into more details about why flies and so on. But I became really fascinated with this topic of sleep because it's really a fundamental question, and there's surprisingly little known about it, despite the fact that it's something that we spend a third of our lives doing. And so when I was trying to figure out what I really wanted to work on, I knew I was broadly interested in neuroscience, and then I kind of surveyed the field a bit and decided that sleep was really a key question. And there's a lot to learn. It impacts so many other things and aspects of brain and body health and so on. And I'm sure we can get more into that. Okay.
Yeah, so I completely agree. I think sleep is something that's very fundamental, and that leads to what I think is, again, a very fundamental question. Um, why do we sleep in the first place? I know that sleeping is very ubiquitous across the animal kingdom. Almost every animal, I think, does sleep. Why do we
Yeah.
sleep? Would be the first question that I would like to
Yeah.
ask.
Yeah. Thank you, Ria. So this is really the million-dollar question. It's what we're all chasing. Why do we sleep? So, as Ria pointed out, sleep is essentially universal. So this is something, the picture that has quite changed quite dramatically actually in the last like 20, 25 years or so. Because previously, there was a lot of work on sleep research, but it was very human centric. Because of course we all have our own personal experience with sleep. It's something we get in and out of every day, right? Um, uh, but that also meant that because we have this kind of personal experience of it, that from a scientific point of view, that sleep research was very kind of human focused. But in the last 20 years or so, it's become pretty clear that it's pretty much universal. Right? So almost all animals do it. So why do they do it? Um, and it can seem to be somewhat disadvantageous because, of course, if you're spending time sleeping, you're not doing other things, right? You're not going out, you're not eating, you're not, trying to find a mate, you're not solving math problems, you're not doing many things, right? So why do it? Um, in fact, this is not an easy question to answer, because particularly in humans, because you might imagine that, once, at least this is my view anyways, is that once you evolve a state like sleep, and pretty much all animals that have a nervous system sleep, right? So once you evolve such a state, a brain state like sleep, can you imagine that, throughout evolution, evolution puts things into that state, right? So there are many things that happen during sleep. So by the time, especially by the time we get to more recently evolved beings such as humans, there's a lot going on, right? Because a lot of things get partitioned into this state once you evolve such a state. So that means that there are many things that go on during sleep. Sleep affects many kinds of things. For example, one of the lines of work in a lab is that it affects the immune system, right? So if you're if you don't sleep so well, you're more likely to catch infections and so on and so forth, right? And it's clearly very important, for the brain too. And that's really, there's this kind of old quote that sleep is by the brain, for the brain, and of the brain. That's not entirely true, but certainly there is a lot. It's clearly very important for brain function. Right. And so a couple of ideas around that have to do with that. One is that that it's important for clearance. So, for example, the idea is that again that you accumulate these kinds of toxic metabolites during waking, and those need to be cleared somehow. And the brain is a different kind of organ in the sense that most other organs in the body have this system called a lymphatic system that drains things, toxic things, but the brain doesn't have that. So one idea is that has come about in the last 10 years or so, is that this clearance kind of happens during sleep in the brain. Okay? And this has some support even in invertebrate models. Another, but that's kind of a passive role for sleep. So that's just something that happens during sleep, but it's not something but sleep is also an active state. Okay? And so one idea that's become kind of popular is that it's important for memory. Okay? And this has wide support across, the animal kingdom. Um, Even most recently in C. elegans, which is a worm that has only 300 neurons, about 900 cells in total, right? But even in this tiny worm, it seems to be important for learning and so on. Um, and I guess we can talk more about memory stuff if you like.
Yeah, so when you say that sleep is really important for memory,
Mhm.
what kind of memories are we talking about? Because as you said, for something to be so ubiquitous and for something to continue across time, uh,
Mhm.
it needs to have some sort of evolutionary significance, right?
Right, right,
So
that's
what
great.
are the, what's the evolutionary significance of retaining memory or having memory?
Oh, yeah, yeah, that's a really, really great question, and I mean, it's great that you thought of it because it isn't entirely obvious. I mean, most people maybe haven't really thought about why you need, why is memory so important, right? Um, so actually, to step back a bit to answer the first part of your question about what kinds of memories. So this idea that sleep is important for memory is now very common, but it really wasn't always the case historically in the sleep field. Right? So there's this kind of there's this old quip from a sleep scientist that the only known function of sleep is to cure sleepiness. That isn't. I mean, that's not true. But it certainly has some grain of truth in it. That in the sense that clearly, when you're sleep deprived, you become very sleepy, and if you're sleepy, you don't do well at many kinds of tasks, right? Um, but it's not just about curing sleepiness, or the impairments don't just come from being sleepy. Uh, Impairments with sleep loss don't just come from being sleepy. So there's a kind of a seminal study about 30 years back now, um, from Matt Wilson, Bruce McNaughton, and this was in rats. And so what they did was to train rats to run along a linear track, like in the Olympics or something. But you can sprinkle a piece of chocolate, kind of along this track, so the rat is motivated to run along this track. And they were recording from a portion of the rat's brain, it's called the hippocampus, okay, while they were doing this, while the rats were doing this. And what they found was that there are some cells in this hippocampus, they're called place cells, and they fire particularly when a rat is in a particular position, spatial position. Right? Um, and so what they found was that uh, as the rat runs along this track, there are these place cells that are activated in a sequence. So that you get a sequence of activation of these so-called place cells, and by reading that sequence, you can know the trajectory of the rat. Okay? But the really interesting thing was that the sequence was then replayed during sleep. Okay, and so this was really cool because it was kind of a fast forward replay, right? And so the idea then is that, and this is really cool because partly because it again reinforces this idea that sleep is active. It's an active state, right? You're not simply like shutting down during sleep. It's not like everything just, press the off button of the brain just shuts off, right? It's not like that. In fact, there's a lot part of the brain that's very active during sleep, and including these memory centers, right? And so the idea is that you're kind of reliving that experience, and that helps you consolidate that into a memory. Okay? So in humans, for example, sleep is particularly important for some kinds of memories that are called declarative memories. Okay, so these are kinds of like episodes in your life. Okay, you can think of it as a memory of an episode. Um, right? Like in your case, you just got out of class, you were in an exam, the exam got late, you came to your dorm room, then you logged into this meeting, and so on. That whole thing is an episode, right? Um, um, right? So those kinds of memories seem to be particularly important. That sleep seems to be important for those kinds of memories. as to what's the significance of memory in general, because you can, for example, have amnesic humans, right? And there are humans who basically can't form memories. And it's not like you die if you can't form memory, right? You're not dead. But the idea, again, the evolutionary significance of memory is really not so much to remember the past very accurately, but the idea is that you can use the past to guide what happens in the future, right? So the idea is that the better you are at remembering what happened in the, of course, you can never predict the future, right? You never know what the future is going to hold, but the best guide you have for the future is the past. So the idea is that you use your past experience, or the brain is using your past experience in a way to guide future behavior, so that you can maybe make better decisions later about what's going to happen, later, right? And that helps. That helps in an evolutionary way. It helps. It helps. You can think of it as helping organisms survive better, because now you had some experience in the past, and you can use that to guide your, survival, your, propagation, so on in the future. So that's the idea.
I think that's an interesting thread, because I've always noticed and I've always read as well that dreams sort of build off of the events of the day, right? So if there's an incomplete thread that you maybe didn't fully think about during the day, they kind of replay at night. And of course, they replay in very quirky ways, but
Right,
they
right.
do replay. And you did mention that state of the mind.
Uh-huh.
So, do dreams arise from that sort of process of memory consolidation, or are they a glitch in the system?
Yeah,
Um, yeah, because they do appear to be these
yeah,
weird exceptions.
yeah. That's a wonderful question, Ria. So the sleep fear has kind of moved away from dreaming a little bit. Um, and because like we said again, the goal of memory is to remember accurately the events of the past, right? And dreaming is clearly not that, right? Not trying to remember something that has happened in the past. But I guess one way to think about it is, I guess, again, riffing off what we just discussed, was that, it could be, there's an idea that I heard that I kind of liked, was that futures. Okay. I think that's kind of an elegant idea, right? So the idea is that you pick together events. The brain is picking together events of the past, um, in some fantastical ways, different combinations, trying to in some way maybe prepare you for, events to come later. Um, and most of dreaming actually happens during the stage of sleep called REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. Um, and again, one of the ideas about functions of REM sleep is that it seems to be particularly important for creativity. Mm. Um, and so that's also very interesting phenomenon. So again, we talked about memory, because memory again is about remembering accurately what's happened in the past. But creativity is not really that either, right? It's something else. You're not remembering something that has happened accurately. You're trying to put together things that are not, maybe that didn't actually happen at the same time, right? So creativity is not about remembering accurately, oh, this happened, A happened first, B happened second, C happened third. But it's about A and B and C didn't actually happen in sequence, but you're kind of putting them together in some sequence, right? Brain is putting them together in a sequence, even though they didn't actually happen in a sequence. And so some of that also seems to benefit that as well. And this kind of like extraction of, for example, there are these people have given kind of tasks where you give people a list of words, like say doctor, nurse, stethoscope, ECG, so on, everything that except the word hospital, right? So hospital is a link word, but you don't actually have the word hospital. So you give a bunch of words that are all linked to the word hospital without the actual word hospital, right? And then that extraction of that gist word seems to be better after a night of sleep, right? So that you're not just, so you can ask people to recall those 10 words that you gave them exactly, and that, sure, that's fine. But there's also this extraction of this gist thing. And that seems to be more of a creative process that also happens, better during sleep. Um,
That's again interesting because then that means that dreams aren't a glitch, but then they do serve some sort of purpose, that being of creativity. Building off of this sort of evolutionary across all my questions. Again, why is creativity important? Like, why is it such a conserved thing? And kind of just as a secondary question to our discussion on dreaming,
mhm.
um, I've frequently had lucid dreams, and I've
Really? Yeah.
yeah, and I
Mm,
kind of like when I was in high school, I
mm,
tried to actively lucid dream. I went down a whole rabbit hole trying to figure
mm,
out how to. I did lucid dream for a
mm,
couple of nights, and I think that's also super interesting because you mentioned REM. REM is an active part of sleep stages, as
mm,
far as I understand them, but
mhm.
and that's when lucid dreams are known to occur.
So sorry, I missed you for about 30 seconds there. So it was saying something about REM sleep and then.
Yeah, so I was just asking about, REM. It's known to be this active state of sleep, right? Your brain.
Mm-hmm.
This is also when you're dreaming.
Right.
REM sleep is also known to be the part where lucid dreams occur within the sleep stages.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of paradoxical to me. Like, if you are in the deepest stage of your sleep,
Yeah.
and your brain is all active, how can you know that you're dreaming? Like, how can you be you're
Yeah.
sleeping?
That's a great point. Yeah, bring up really great points. So lucid dreaming, is this idea that you can actually, so you're aware of the fact that you're dreaming, right? While you're sleeping at this dream state. Um, so it's a little, it's it's actually quite, so we know that you can, I mean, it's known that you can train yourself to lucid dream, okay, and become better at it. But the mechanisms behind lucid dreaming actually have been quite hard to study, because they so it's technical, mostly for technical reasons. First of all, not many people can lucid dream. It's not a very common thing. And even amongst that, bringing people into a lab setting and so on is another beast altogether. So then that lucid dreaming becomes even less frequent, right? So it's a very interesting phenomenon, but it's been technically difficult to study in a systematic way. So, I mean, you bring up some very important contradictions, right? How come you're not so easily aroused from REM sleep, but at the same time you seem to be conscious and so on. It's a very important, it's an interesting phenomenon, and it's just been difficult to study it. There's one recentish paper from Ken Paller, um, and so Ken has done a lot of work on REM sleep, and so Ken and some colleagues in a few places in Europe, Ken is based in the US. So they had shown that you can actually communicate, like the experimenter, by you mean the experimenter can actually communicate with people when they're lucid dreaming. So that you can ask them questions like what is 6 plus 2, and they would kind of twitch their face and so on to indicate the answer is 8, something like that, right? Which is pretty cool, I think. So yeah, but it's been a little difficult to study the problem, and since it isn't that common, it's probably more of some kind of epiphenomenon rather than really related to the core functions of sleep. Um,
Do you think in general it's
mm,
tougher to study sleep in humans because, of course, it's a very, you know, you can't really speak to them because they're sleeping, but you need to know what their brain's doing while they're sleeping.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's difficult, is that why the use of rats, like in the study that you said, and you yourself work with Drosophila, um, how are these model organisms sort of subbing in for what we can't study in humans?
Right. No, those are great points. So, there's a couple of things. One is philosophical, which is that, if you're studying a phenomenon that's essentially universal, like sleep, right? Then you want to not restrict yourself to just one species, right? So the idea is that if the phenomenon you're studying is universal, whatever theories you come up to explain this phenomenon have to be universal in their scope as well, right? So I think for that reason, for that reason, I think, it's a good thing to study a diversity of animals, right? So that you get some idea of what's going on across animals. Um, and but many it turns out, for example, many model organisms have similar sleep patterns to ours. Like, for example, Drosophila that we study in the lab, they sleep a lot like us, in the sense they sleep mostly through the night, with a little noontime siesta. um, and they show ontogenetic changes like humans. For example, baby flies will sleep a lot. All flies don't sleep so well. You can give them pharmacological compounds that modulate sleep and wake in humans. Will also modulate sleep and wake in flies. Like caffeine will keep a fly awake. Antihistamines make them drowsy, and so on, right? And a lot of the sleep functions also are also found in flies. So, for example, if you sleep deprive a fly, they don't learn so well the next day, and so on, right? So they have a lot of parallels, and then of course you have a lot of access to genetic tools and so on, um, that you don't have in humans, right? So that lot since again, I could go back to the idea that since phenomenon is essentially universal, that you want to study it in a range of species, study it at a level where and in species where you can really get down to a level of detail that you would not be able to technically be able to get to in humans.
So maybe talking more about the experimental methods that you just mentioned, I'm interested in just knowing about, um, like, let's restrict ourselves to Drosophila because I worked with them before and I
Yeah,
really
yeah,
like working with flies.
right. Yeah,
Uh, but sleep, like how do you know that they're sleeping? How do you know for
yeah,
how long they're sleeping? You mentioned they have some sort of a circadian rhythm. How is
right,
that
right.
measured? Just kind of the
That's great.
experimental nitty-gritty.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Ria. So, we can define. So, how you define sleep is actually not a trivial thing. So it turns out that there's a few criteria that we use to define a sleep state, largely by looking at the behavior. So you could look at, clearly the animal has to be not moving for a period of time, so it has to be what's called quiescent. Okay? Of course, that isn't sufficient because you could be in a coma, be paralyzed and not moving, right? So, how to distinguish sleep from being? So the sleep state has to be reversible. That means if you stimulate the animal hard enough, you should come out of it fast. Um, and that isn't sufficient because you could just be, bored or something, right? Just sitting quietly and not moving, right? So how do you distinguish sleep from quiet waking? So to that, you have this measurement of something called an arousal threshold. That means that you have to be harder to arouse when you sleep, and we already alluded to that. So you stimulate the animal more, harder to rouse the animal from sleep. Okay? Right, and the last is that it's homeostatically regulated. That means that if you deprive the animal of sleep, the next day you should sleep more or deeper or both or something, right? So these are the criteria that have been used to define sleep. And of course, there's also changes in brain activity, right? So you together, these can be used to define a sleep state. And as to how we measure it, we actually have a very simple way of measuring it, which is to track the activity of the flies. So you can actually put these flies in these little glass tubes, like that long, and they'll walk up and down the length of these tubes. And there's a little food at one end, the other end is like stoppered. Right? So they'll walk up and down the length of this tube. But in the middle of the tube, you have a little infeed. Okay, so it gives you a little blip, the fly's active, right? And a lot of foundational work in the field had shown um, that that more than 95 flies that don't move for at least 5 minutes will show change in this so-called arousal threshold. Okay, which means they're harder to arouse if they've not been moving for at least 5 minutes. Since that's a defining trait of sleep, we can just say if the fly is not moving for 5 minutes, it's sleeping. Okay? And this is also associated with changes in brain activity and so on and so forth. So we can just use the behavior of the fly and know when it's asleep or not, right? And we can do this in a very high throughput way. So for example, in a lab, we can measure sleep of like 2,500 flies at a time. So this becomes, really scalable. Yeah.
Yeah, so again, really interesting because 5 minutes, when I first learned about 5 minutes being the minimum time for a sleep bout, it felt really small to me. It felt like, fly would be inactive for 5 minutes anyway. I think the field is a little
Right.
mistaken there. So,
Right, right. No, that's fair. But again, the idea is that if you're just bored and not moving for 5 minutes, something like that, right? But
yeah.
again, that's the idea. The idea is that because you have this change in this arousal threshold, that's a defined trait of sleep. We can say with some confidence that they're really sleeping, and it's also associated with changes in brain activity and other things. Um, but yeah, otherwise it seems somewhat arbitrary. Why five? Why not six or
Yeah.
three or something, right? Yeah,
And I
yeah, because of the yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
no, and I
Mm.
think that also kind of does speak to diversity in how animals get their sleep. I know
Mhm.
dolphins can sleep with one eye open. Drosophila seem to sleep for 5 minutes, and that's still
Oh,
considered sleep.
oh, right, right. That's true.
Birds sleep while they're in flight.
Uh-huh.
So why is there so much variation? Why can't we just all decide?
Yeah, so again, sorry, but it seems like I'm breaking up a bit. At least maybe the connection in my office isn't the best, but yeah, this is a great puzzle. It's a great mystery. You brought up a really great point, which is why is there such great diversity in the amount of time animals spend sleeping, right? And so this is it's puzzled a lot of people, and there isn't really a good um, explanation for it. So you'd think maybe that, if you were really big, if you were a big animal with a big body and a big brain, maybe you need to sleep more, right? Um, but it turns out the elephants sleep only like 2 to 3 hours a night, if that, right? And whereas something like a sloth, that is a small animal, can sleep, or a fruit bat can sleep 18 hours a day, right? So there's not really a good explanation for why you have this wide variation in the time that you spend sleeping. So one idea that I like is that maybe only a portion of the time that we spend sleeping is actually needed for sleep to carry out some essential function, right? And the rest of the time you spend sleeping is largely dictated by your ecology. So whatever, depending on your species kind of ecological needs, you can, modify the time spent sleep. Maybe some sleep more because, you might, if you get out in the world, you might get into trouble, get eaten or something, right? So it makes sense to just stay in a nest or a hole on the ground or something and not get out into the world. But some portion of that time you spend sleeping is clearly important because sleep has important functions, but maybe not all of it, right? Um,
I
yeah.
think that's a pretty nice, elegant solution.
Mm.
But does now is known to sleep for really long periods.
Mm.
Um,
Sorry, I couldn't hear that. You said something is known to sleep for long periods, but
oh, hello.
yes, yes.
Yeah, so if an animal sleeps for a really
Uh,
long period right now, and someone in that population suddenly just starts sleeping for lesser time, does
uh-huh.
that mean then that trait will get selected for? Is that kind of what that implies, since only a minimum is needed?
I mean, well, I think that's a good point, but although you're conflating a couple of things there. So one is that, what you select for is more complicated. So what you select for is for what you by meaning what evolution selects for um, is for evolutionary fitness, which is a combination of many things. So part of it could be what an individual animal needs for individual animal in a population needs for its optimal functioning, right? But part of it could be what is this the population as a whole, what benefits a population as a whole, right? So some of the like I was saying, if you had a clearly species do as a species, you do have a certain amount of time that they spend sleeping, right? So clearly that has been selected for in some way, right? So it has some evolutionary advantage. Evolutionary advantage probably being that as a species, you maybe you don't want if you like I was saying, right? If you get out of the world, you get into trouble, you get eaten, whatever, right? So you find a safe place and kind of ride it out. Or if you're, say a blind cave fish or something that are in the bottom of these, caves in Mexico, then you don't have eyes, you've lost your eyes, and suddenly you're in this. So your main goal is let me go out and find food, right? So I was suppressed. So they suppress sleep. So the blind cave fish sleep very little. Mm. Very little. And this is presumably because their primary goal is I need to go out and find food and not spend time, sleeping. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. I also think that the outreach team has posted a short webinar poll
Yeah.
um, for the audience to answer. So maybe I think we should wait a few minutes for
Yeah.
that.
Meanwhile, Professor, do you want to answer some of the questions? There's a lot of interest generated
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Uh, Meanwhile, until you wait for the poll, maybe do you want to? I'll raise the questions for you just to make it easier. So, one of the there was a common question between two of them. It's similar, so I've coupled together. What is the main reason for when we are studying sleep attacks more than in normal time? And someone else said where who asked a very similar question on those lines. Why is it that we are more
Prone to being
active?
sleepy when you're, why is it that you're more prone to suddenly feeling sleepy when you have to study?
Yes, and similar to something in numericals, something to do with numericals, as to how it puts them to sleep a little more when they have numbers to play with, and then you know, yeah. So I coupled those two questions together. Please.
Yeah. Well, I'd say in general, trying to cram the night before isn't a good idea. So, I would say if you're sleepy around your exam, that's not a bad thing. It's probably a good thing. I think if you sleep well, you're more likely to do well on your test. So, there's a lot of research on learning and, how people learn better and so on. So the more you space out your learning, the better it is. But of course, sleep is not going to help you remember something that you never learned in the first place. So if you haven't studied at all, and then the night before an exam and you studied zero, then you're not going to benefit much from sleep. But the goal is not to be in that kind of situation, right? So you don't want to be you want to be like Ria, who I'm sure is like, revised everything like 5 times before the night before the test. So, uh, right. Yeah. So be like Ria, don't be like me.
Definitely not. Uh, for context, I have taken a course with Professor, and I can attest none of us were getting sleep the night before. Um, so no, yeah.
Um, right. There's another question on recommendations for books that for invoking lucid dreaming and psychic dreaming, uh, and on something on similar lines. How do you improve dream recall? Yeah. So I'm just combining two different questions for.
So lucid dreaming, again, is absolutely fascinating subject, and it's something you can apparently people can train themselves to lucid dream. And there's some I don't know about books, but certainly there's some actually reasonable evidence that meditation and so on can help, particularly some kinds of Buddhist meditation practices and so on. So that maybe something something to try. But in general, I would say don't fret too much about it. I think people spend a lot of time thinking about their dreams and so on, and it can be quite counterproductive. So in general, I would say just don't worry too much about it. Um,
Any book recommendations for something similar that just in case
sure. I mean, there's a couple of
for dream recall? Yeah.
good books on sleep science, in general. There's Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. Um, so I think that's a pretty good, popular science book. So yeah, would start there.
Um, there's another question, couple of questions about memory retention, specifically connected to sleeping or lack of sleep, right? Uh, so, are there any techniques or strategies that one can use to sort of enhance memory retention during sleep?
Techniques or strategies to enhance memory retention during sleep. Right? That
Or
is
does it actually, like, if it
so
affects,
hard, but
like,
I
your
would
a bad sleep? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, generally not getting enough sleep is, going to hurt your memory pretty badly. So I think the best thing you can do is just ensure that you're getting, good restful sleep, which, there's, people usually recommend just keeping your room cool, making sure that it's dark, while you're asleep and trying to practice good sleep hygiene. That means try to find like approximately the same time that that you can, go to bed at and wake up the next morning and so on. And of course, there are several, pressures that, prevent this from, both, work-related pressures, but also, social pressures, right? Because people tend to, stay up later on the weekends and so on, right? There was, in fact, some recent work on this so-called social jet lag, which shows that it can lead to impairments that are similar to a night without sleep. Um, so as far as possible, try to avoid that.
Right. There's a question on. I think it's fairly understood that lack of sleep does affect the brain and mind capabilities through, a lot of this discussion. But there's a continuation to that. as a question. Can it somehow be healed and recovered?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm glad for this question, because that's the good news, right? We're talking about bad news, which is like, oh, sleep loss is bad for you, it's going to do horrible things to you, and so on. But the good news is that the brain is fairly plastic, and so and sleep seems to be very important for not only consolidating memories in healthy brains, but also being able to restore functioning to impaired brains. And so this is some work that we do as well in the lab, which is you can enhance sleep, different ways. There are different ways of enhancing sleep. You can enhance sleep. We have a drug called gaboxetol, which works really well to enhance sleep, and that helps restore functioning even to memory mutants and so on. But we can also do it behaviorally. So, there's something called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is a set of behavioral modifications, that 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 are mostly centered around actually restricting the time in bed and restricting the opportunity for sleep, which might seem a bit counterintuitive, because you might think, oh, if you're, for example, if you're having trouble sleeping, that you should just be in bed longer. But actually, what seems to help is to actually restrict the time in bed. Okay, so train yourself to sort of um, think that really a bed is a place for sleep, right? And and we can do this even in the fly that I like so much, right? We can't really restrict a fly's time in bed, but you can change the light dark schedule in a way that shorten the dark period so that you have less time to sleep. And that actually helps improve their sleep and actually helps improve memory as well. So, um,
Right. Arya, did you have any other couple of questions that you'd want Professor to answer? Because there are a few questions from the audience, so either of us could pitch in for these questions. We have some time, so
Yeah, I think at the beginning of the webinar, Professor was talking about, how he explored all these different disciplines before realizing that neuroscience research and sleep
mhm,
research in particular was for him. Since our audience is made up of high school students,
mhm.
and because I am an undergraduate, I think it could be really nice to just talk about maybe how you navigated all these different paths and what kind of drew you to neuroscience.
Yeah, that's a great, it's a great question. So I'll answer this by telling a little bit about my own trajectory. And it's not to say that, this is the way to do things or anything, but just to give you kind of an example, maybe a data point for you to, think about, which is that a lot of people's trajectories are not linear. So many times you think, as particularly when you're, in high school or an undergraduate, you think of life as a kind of linear upward trajectory, right? That you constantly have to keep achieving, you have to hit these goalposts along the way to get to whatever you imagined, success to be, right? And then, the corollary of that is that you get very stressed when you have this image in your head that life is like this, and then suddenly for some time when life goes like this, and you're like, oh no, why am I not, on this linear path, right? And but it's not linear. So I was trained as an engineer, um, in biotechnology, um, and I was always more curious about basic science, and so the Department of Zen was a very good department for basic biology as well, in addition to being an engineering department. So well trained, and then at the time I was thinking, I was more interested in developmental biology, um, and so when I applied for graduate schools, I was applying to developmental biology labs. And then I started this development biology lab, and then as I started, during in graduate school, I started reading some more papers on neuroscience, including some of the first papers that described sleep in flies. And I became more interested in neuroscience. So then I tried to combine kind of this developmental biology and neuroscience, um, for a PhD, which was more about how circuits are wired during development. And neural circuits get wired during development. And then later, again, I was, thinking more about, as I went along during PhD, I was thinking more about how circuits function and how those function changes with internal state and so on. Um, so I would say, in general, and while I was in engineering, I really hated it. I'll be honest, I hated it. I hated taking the engineering classes. I said, this is just awful. I just want to, I'm more interested, more passionate about this kind of basic questions about, very big fundamental questions. Why do I have to do all this boring stuff? And it just drives me bonkers. But, in hindsight, that training is actually very helpful for me now. So now I think I can, use some of the engineering tools that I had learned, in order to apply that, to solve very basic questions. So we design a lot, we build a lot of things ourselves, in the lab, and including some devices to measure arousal thresholds that we talked about and so on, and memory and things like that, right? And manipulate circuits using light with optogenetics and stuff like that. So that engineering training was actually quite helpful. And what I always like to tell students in my lab is you want to get to a stage where you're only limited by your imagination. Okay? So if you can, and a lot of neuroscience now is DIY, do it yourself, right? So if you can kind of pick up those skills that allow you to, if you have an idea, to kind of build something quickly, to prototype it and test it out and so on, so that you can, design some small kind of hardware. You have a little bit of coding skills that allow you to write some software as well. That then allows you to get to the stage where really the ideas are the only thing that's limiting, right? And that's where I think, most young people particularly should try to get to, because particularly I think in the age of AI and so on, um, that adaptability is really key, right? So you can't really do, so it used to be, at least when I was getting my PhD and so on, there were a lot of faculty who were doing the same thing for 40 years, right? But that's not going to be the case anymore. You have to be constantly adaptable, and so on. So I think, as young people, that's what I would strongly suggest, is to tinker more and be comfortable with that.
Yeah, I think it's nice to hear that you had this foray with engineering before you came
Mhm.
and settled on neuroscience. I think that's also one of the things that I do appreciate about being at Ashoka, the ability to kind of be in all different labs.
Mhm.
I was working on evolution in my first year, and now I'm at Professor Lasya's lab, and we work on
Mhm.
antibiotic resistance.
Mhm.
So I think it's fun to be able to tinker, definitely. I
Right.
also found this really interesting question from the Q&A box.
Mhm.
Is 7 hours, and how was that number decided?
Sorry, what do you say? Is 7 hours what?
Is 7 hours really the optimal amount of sleep, and how was that number decided? I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, I mean, most people would say, 7 to 8 hours on average. But again, that depends. Of course, it varies, from person to person. And certainly there's some people that might need a little bit more. Maybe some people can do with a little bit less. But it's just on average, it's just what you see in a population. When you compare people that sleep, 7 to 8 hours versus people that sleep less and so on, right? 5 to 6 hours and so on. So as a group, certainly the group of people that are sleeping 7 to 8 hours tend to do better on various kinds of cognitive tests. They're better, generally healthier and so on, right? But of course, that's an average. So there's some, since this is a, common, webinar that's going out to a lot of people, one should also, caution people a little bit, because there's a lot of, particularly young people, because there's a lot of like, on social media and so on, there's all these people who think like, oh, look at me, I'm so tough. I'm the best. I can do with like 2 hours of sleep, and here's how you do it, and so on and so forth, right? So there's all this like social media pressure to sleep less and do great. But one thing I say is that by and large, most, while it's true that some people can apparently do with slightly less than others, but I will say that, by and large, even a lot of times when we bring people into the lab, a sleep lab, who say that, look, I'm doing great, with whatever 4 hours of sleep or something, it turns out they're not actually doing as great as they think they are, right? So you have this perception that you're doing fine, but really you're not doing as fine as you think you are, right? And of course, the sort of corollary to that is, just because you think you're doing fine, maybe you'll do even better if you slept better, right? Um, so yeah, so that's kind of a long answer, but yeah.
Another couple of questions. Maybe we can take a couple of them and then
I,
we
I,
can
I, I
close.
I actually like this question. Do you think the line between sleep and wakefulness is as clear as we believe? Are there parts of your mind where we're never fully awake? So I like that one. So no, not that I don't like the others, but I like that one. So the idea was, so this is actually an interesting, very interesting, idea, which is that part of, maybe not, and Ria sort of briefly alluded to that when she spoke about the dolphins that sleep with half their brain at the time, right? Um, and so the idea is that, can a part of the brain be awake while the rest is asleep, or sleeping while the rest is awake? And so this idea of kind of local sleep, which again is something that has been developing in the last 10 years or so, which is that parts of your brain, for example, that part of a brain maybe that you use a lot, you're doing some complicated mathematical task or something. So there's some part of your brain that's being used a lot for that task, and that part can briefly go offline, okay, while the rest of your brain is, well, you are awake, right? But that part of your brain is sleeping. So this is again a very, very, I think, interesting idea. This idea of local sleep and local wake. Uh, yeah. Hmm.
There's a question on more of a practical
Mhm.
solution and its its application. It's about somebody asked whether white music works well in some cases. This comes as a concern for lower sleeping hours, and apparently it does help. But uh, how real is that?
Yeah,
And
it can help. It can help in the sense that, generally anxiety or stress, tends to lead to poor sleep, right? And you tend to wake up more. So anything that kind of reduces your anxiety, calms you down, is a good thing. It'll help you fall asleep faster and sleep better. And if white noise can help with that, then great. Mm.
right. So one last question related to the subject, I guess, and then we can close the session. Um, Is it true that in medieval times people slept in two shifts, a first
Yeah.
sleep and a second sleep? And does modern sleep science think that this might be a natural pattern?
Yeah. So that's a good question. And it turns out actually the evidence for this is actually quite scant. And it's largely from a couple of like novels that were written, English novels that were written in 1600s or something, that seem to describe this. So it's not entirely clear that this was actually what happened in medieval times, since the sources are so limited. It's literally like two novels, right? And so more broadly, I guess the broader way to think about it is, was it is since clearly right now, we're in this situation where we have, you have modern technology, you have your phones on all the time, you're getting all the social media stuff, and then you have a lot of light, artificial lighting, and so on. So you might think that maybe, sleep problems are because of modern technology, right? But one has to also keep in mind that there's a lot of creature comforts that come with modern life, like air conditioning and a reasonably safe place and so on and so forth. And so that in ancient times that wasn't always the case, right? So there were a lot of other pressures that may have meant that people in older times weren't necessarily sleeping optimally either, but for different reasons, right? So we solved some of those problems, like for example finding a nice cool place and a safe place and so on and so forth, but it created some other problems, and some newer problems and so on.
All right. Thank you, Professor. I'll just take up one of the questions which are related to the admissions.
Mm.
So somebody had asked that we mentioned that the admissions are open for the upcoming academic year, but the website shows that there's no live forms. So the registrations are open, not the application portal. And the registration link will be shared with you on the chat box, which is what we were earlier mentioning about the relevance of making a registration. And then you will be notified as soon as the admission timelines are out, right? So don't confuse live application with the pre-registrations. Somebody else asked me a question related to support provided with people with disabilities. Yes, we have an office for learning support. We have support that we give right from the application form up until you join Ashoka and after you join Ashoka. So whatever sort of support is required right from the beginning of the application form to the test, interviewing, and then eventually in your journey with Ashoka, there will be. So you can mention the application form always allows you to provide enough details and supporting documents that you can provide. So yes, you could apply with us. With that, have we concluded the session? Do you think, Ria, are we good? Have we answered most of the questions we wanted to raise? Uh, with that, if that's the case, I think I'll take this opportunity to close the session. Right?
Yeah, I think this was a wonderful introduction to neuroscience for me. And any outstanding questions, I'll be sure to pester Professor with in office hours.
Yes.
Lovely.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's
Thank you
great.
so much for such an insightful session, Professor, and thank you, Ria. Thank you, audience, for joining in. I hope you got a glimpse into the mysteries of sleep. Before we wrap up the session, we would really appreciate if you could take up a minute to share your valuable feedback with us. The link to the feedback form is provided in the chat box. Please note that the recording of this session will be available on Ashoka's YouTube channel in case you would like to share it with your friends. The next webinar of Explore is scheduled for Monday, that is 6th October at 6 p.m. The session will be delivered by Professor Parush Arora. He's the Assistant Professor of Economics at Ashoka University. The title of his talk is How Economics Changes the Way We Think. I would once again like to inform our audience that registrations for the undergraduate program starting next year in August 2026 are open, so register soon. If you have any further queries regarding various other aspects of the university, you can always write to us at ugapply@ashoka.edu.in. Once again, I thank our speakers for taking out time to participate in this discussion. This brings us to the end of the discussion. Please take care and enjoy your evening. Thank you.
Thank you all. Please feel free to reach out with questions if you have any. Thanks.